So as Carly mentioned, just think about your own life and just start to remember there are scars on most of us. If you've lived long enough, you're going to bear a scar of some point. And you look down and you begin to realize that even though it happened a long time ago, you can still see the faint outline of a scar. And you remember exactly where you were, what you were doing, what happened, the events of the day. Maybe you fell off your bike, maybe you ran into the corner of the table, maybe it was a surgery or something else, but every scar has a story, and we all have scars. I was talking to a bunch of young adults one time years ago. I think I've shared this with some of you, and we were just talking about the intimacy of being a parent and what a privilege it is, and that we have this incredible bond and relationship with our kids, and we can actually tell the scars. We know exactly what happened and the scars on our children. And I was talking about what a privilege that was, how intimate it is that we actually know and we can recall with vivid detail exactly where we were, what happened, how we responded, all those kinds of things. And I remember I was talking to this group, and it's what I was trying to make this point that somehow we have this incredible privilege, this intimate relationship that we actually know even the scars on their body. That's what I was trying to say. What I actually said was, we all have children no one else knows about. And everybody in the room raised their head like, oh my gosh. But as soon as it went out of my mouth, I knew that's not exactly what I meant to say. Scars tell a story, though, and we all have a story. And what the fundamental part of this story is that Jesus has his own scars. And his story is our story as well. In fact, he showed us his scars. If you go back to John 20, after the resurrection, Jesus encounters Thomas. Thomas is the last to come. A week later, all the other disciples have seen the risen Christ. Thomas is not. Thomas is filled with doubt. And there's this classic, iconic moment in which Thomas says, unless I see the scars, I will not believe. And Jesus extends his hands. If you need to touch them, feel them, but here are the scars. And Thomas believes. So we're on this journey called Lent. We do this every single year, have done it for thousands of years. I'm always intrigued with the fact that we kind of know where this story is going. It's not a huge surprise. We're going to follow Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. And we're going to track his movement, listen to his teachings, watch how he responds to people, the miracles, the healings, all those things that take place. But we know this story because we know it well. He's going to be greeted with great crowds, but by the time the week is over, he will be abandoned by his closest friends, betrayed by one of them, arrested, tortured, finally crucified, and then ultimately risen. And that's the non-negotiable part of our faith, the risen Christ. We believe in the resurrection. That's what we know. But we almost act every year as if we don't know this story, that we're going to find at the end this great revelation, great surprise. But we already know it. So in literary works, there's called reverse chronology, meaning you start at the end and you work backwards. So why not start at the end and work backwards? Start at the end knowing the story, knowing that he rises from the grave, knowing that he shows the scars. So what does it mean for us and on this journey? And what can it teach us and what can it show us? And to be able to say, we know what's going to happen. He is ultimately going to be crucified on a cross. And that's the problem. Because the cross, if you really step back and think about it, doesn't make any sense at all. The fact of the matter is it shouldn't have ever happened. If you have any sense that this is really God's son, this is not the way the story ought to play out. And so the cross has been a conundrum for generations of people. A stumbling block is what Paul describes it as. We'd rather just not think about it or deal with it. Let's get on with the resurrection. Let's skip the ugly part about the cross. And yet embedded in the Gospels is this notion of a cross. And it's central to the story. Somebody much smarter than I pointed out that if you follow Jesus in the Gospels, you'll discover something interesting. In the beginning, the crowds are big, they're huge, they're excited, they're fanatically following him. He creates miracles, creates more crowds, his teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, great crowds, feeding of the 5,000, massive crowds who come to sense what he's teaching, to either be a recipient of a miracle, to understand who this person really is, holding out the hope that he might be the one. A person pointed out the fact that as you begin reading it, what you'll see is a transition. At the beginning, more and more people. Toward the end, fewer and fewer people. By the end, It's simply people walking away, abandoning him, his own closest friends. One betrays him. A few of them gather around a table. By the time he hangs on a cross, it's only his mother and a handful of people, which means closer you get to the cross, you find fewer and fewer people, which I think is a profound truth. Cross has been a problem for a long time, but it tells us something I think we all need to hear, something sometimes we don't really want to think about it, but it tells us the truth that we already know, that none of us get through this life without being scarred. Life is hard. Life presents challenges, unexpected tragedies, devastation. Just read 2 Corinthians 4. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Listen to this. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. So we all have scars, and every scar we have has a story that goes along with it. And maybe the most painful ones are the ones you don't actually see, the emotional scars. But the scars that we see are a reminder. They signify that we've been wounded, we've been hurt, but it's also a sign of healing has already begun to take place. And we never want our scars to define us, but we do want them to remind us that we all need grace. And this is a hard subject because there are people in every congregation I've ever served who have been hurt, scarred by religion. And maybe that's the deepest cut of all, because you have this expectation that everybody you're going to encounter in church is trustworthy, they're kind, they're compassionate, they're going to do the right thing, they hold themselves to the highest possible standards, and it's almost like you make yourself vulnerable, and then when the hurt comes, when you're disappointed, when you're betrayed, you're deceived, you're coerced, you're manipulated, the disillusionment comes, and the cut might be the deepest cut ever. A lot of people have their own stories about being wounded, and it comes with this terrible realization of shame and guilt and rejection and legalism and bigotry and all those things that come with it. And it's even more impactful because you did not expect it. It was the last place in the world that you would have thought you would receive it. I saw a survey the other day I thought was fascinating. They said in any given congregation today, there's about 47% of the people who would acknowledge that they have been wounded to some degree by religion, which is a high percentage. So if that's true in this room, 47% of you would fill out that survey and say, at some point in my journey, religion wounded me or hurt me, or I was hurt by a church, or I was hurt by another individual, or something happened in a conflict that left me devastated. What I find remarkable is the 47% of those that would respond are still here, which means you're still here, which means if you were wounded, hurt, I think it's remarkable that you're still hoping, praying, believing that there's something good, that you began to separate some things from the core things and acknowledge our broken humanity, but also understood the goodness and the promise of the gospel itself. So John chapter 9, that Sharon just read, I think it's a story. And when I read it, it just sort of strikes me. It's almost this case study model of what it means to be spiritually abused. And if you look at it as not just a healing story, but something else going on, the dynamics, you begin to break it down, you realize we repeat it over and over again. It's happened over and over, unfortunately. It's a story of religious abuse in the life of Jesus. He's going on to Jerusalem. He encounters the man who has been born blind. His disciples are the one who are going to ask the question. And they never think about any other question because they just make an assumption. Well, who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents that sinned that caused him to be blind? Because that's the assumption. He did something wrong. Somebody did something wrong. Somebody sinned. If you're blind, that means God is not pleased with whatever you've done or whatever your parents may have done. Because you have to find a reason for the blame. You have to understand why it's happened, to be rational about it. And the disciples are asking Jesus, well, who sinned, him or his parents? And what Jesus says is, neither one of them. It's not what this is about. Sometimes life just happens. And Jesus says he didn't do anything, nor did his parents. But then he begins to heal him in the way that you've heard described. The man receives his sight, which ought to be the most euphoric, celebratory thing that you could ever imagine. He goes back into his neighborhood, and you know what the response is? hey, aren't you the guy that used to be blind? What happened to you? They're not so thrilled. They're confused, and they're a little fearful because their whole universe has been upset. How can a blind man see? We knew who he was. We knew where he fit in the scheme of things, and we knew where he belonged on the pecking order, and suddenly now he's able to see, and it doesn't make any sense. So their world is turned upside down, and they're really questioning because they don't know what's happening. So what do? They go to religious leaders to say, we don't really understand what's happened. Either this is the greatest thing that's ever happened or it's not, but we don't understand it. Here's the problem. Jesus heals them on the Sabbath, which you and I wouldn't think make much of a difference, but the religious leaders now make that the central part of this story. The problem was he did it on the Sabbath. He worked on the Sabbath. Even if you want to interpret the minutia, this idea of putting together dirt, mud, spitting, and no, that's work if you really want to be legalistic about it. And it's this sort of got you moment. So the religious leaders now bring in the parents, and they ask him, tell me what's going on. Is this your son? Yes, it's my son. Was he blind at birth? Yes, he was blind at birth. And now he sees? Yes. So how did this happen? The parents say, we don't know. You need to ask our son. They say we don't know because they're deathly afraid. Because the religious leaders have the power. If they answer wrong or incorrectly, they can be ousted from synagogue. They can be pushed away from the community. Their business will suffer. Their reputation will be lost. Everything will be devastated. It's all gone. They don't even want to answer. They push it off, kick the can down the road. You need to ask our son. Because they know if you follow Jesus, you're no longer welcome in the community. Your neighbors will turn on you. And so they bring back the man who received his sight from Jesus, and he tells the story again, and they said it can't happen, and they call him a sinner. And I love this because I'm paraphrasing, but he says to the religious leaders, look, I'm no theologian. All I know is this. Once I was blind, now I see. And you know what they do right after he says that? They kick him out of the synagogue because he was a sinner, didn't belong. This idea of the devastation that the highest moment of your life, you receive your sight, and then in turn, in the next breath, you lose your community. It's devastating. I sort of begin to think about this spiritual abuse that tends to happen sometimes in unhealthy, toxic areas, even in churches and ministry as well. So there's really about 3 of them that you could point to. I'm sure there's quite a few more. But one is this fixation on having to blame others for everything. We look for scapegoats. It's embedded in the Old Testament. If you understand the idea of a scapegoat is we have to take our sins and project them onto somebody else to make ourselves feel better about us. So we can always point to somebody who is less than us so that it makes us feel morally superior. We elevate ourselves by minimizing other people. And the real irony is this should have been the greatest day, should have been great healing. How are you not happy for a man who was once blind but now receives his sight? Why are you fixated on who to blame? Because it upsets your universe that you would have to actually reconfigure it. We have to find somebody to blame. And if we point the sin in other people, it actually takes it away from our obligation. Look how bad that other person is. I'm not nearly as bad. In fact, I'm so much better. Second form of spiritual abuse is to make people just conform. That it's more important to conform to the rules than it is to have a relationship with God. That if you want to be with us, you have to be exactly like us. And they believe the person who was born blind was blind because he sinned. That's the law. That makes sense. We can deal with that. What we can't deal with is this miracle we can't explain, we can't grasp. And the problem is when Jesus heals him, he heals him on the Sabbath, and that's the breaking and the violation of the law. How are you so fixated on keeping the rules that you can't celebrate somebody who's been liberated from blindness? Because religious leaders of the day want to put God in a box. And what they want to say is, if you don't fit in this box, you don't belong. If you don't think like us, act like us, believe like us, then there is no place for you here with us. He didn't fit in the box anymore. They can't explain it, so they kick him out. And the third one is just the separation of those who don't fit in. Because that's the devastating part of this story. He does lose everything, and he knows that his parents are running at risk as well. It's the piety of the community we have to maintain, so we have to kick you out because you don't belong. And it really calls into question that nobody in this story can really be honest, because they know the devastation is going to happen if they are honest. Because if you're expelled from the community, you can't worship with them, you can't do business with them, you can't have the community relationships that are so important. The blind man was thrown out, excommunicated, because they believed he was a sinner. And I think sometimes we still do that. And even if we say, well, we're going to accept people, but to the degree that they're going to eventually come and be more like us, yeah, you're welcome, as long as you're kind of like us, and we'll wait around and we'll be patient until you become more and more like us. Thankfully, the story doesn't end there. The story is great. And if you never, go back and read John 9. Jesus, after all this dialogue, all the drama, seeks out the man that he healed of his blindness. And he goes and finds him. And they have a conversation. And the question is, from Jesus to the man who is blind, do you believe in the Son of Man? Which is a code word. Do you believe in the Messiah? Do you believe that God would send the one who is to redeem this world, to save Israel, the one who is the holiest of holies, the one who is truly the Son of God? Do you believe? And the man answers, if I knew who he was, I'd want to believe in him. And Jesus' response is, you're looking at him. I gave you eyes so that you could see for yourself. And the man drops on his knees and begins to worship Jesus. That's the key, to worship Jesus. It's more than singing songs or reciting creeds. It's worshiping him by following him, by acting like him, by loving like him, by living like him. And the answer is that it means you might be rejected by people who demand that you believe what they believe, and you think like they think, you act like they act. I think it's remarkable in any given church how many people have been hurt, wounded by religion, whether unintentionally or intentionally. And it really might be the deepest cut of our lives. And how remarkable it is that so many of us are still here, still fighting the good fight, still believing. And maybe it required some level of forgiveness. It doesn't mean we forget it, doesn't mean we just excuse it. It just means I'm going to have to acknowledge there were some broken people. And broken people tend to break other people. Hurt people tend to hurt other people. And to acknowledge the imperfections of all of us, to acknowledge the damage that was done, but then learn from it and grow through it. And we all have our scars. But it also means that we may hurt, but we one day will heal. And the scars will never going to define us completely, but we hope they do remind us that we all need grace. We all have scars, and every scar has a story. And Jesus showed us his scars, which I think is the way you start this story at the end and work backwards. So if Jesus has his scars and he's willing to show us his scars, and his scars don't go away and they're part of his journey, it's a good question. It's going to be a part of our journey as well. So if you've been hurt by religion, if you've been hurt by a church, if you've been devastated, deceived, if you've been rejected, hurt deeply, take heart, because you're not alone. One who hangs on a cross loves you more than you will ever imagine. And he has the scars to prove it.